Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach and the light novel Can't Fear Your Own World in the video to come. The end of the 1000-Year Blood War arc left us with a lot of questions, including leaving the fates of several fan-favourite characters completely up in the air. Despite the epilogue doing its absolute best to close the book on Bleach, showing us where much of the cast ended up in the decade following the war, there were some characters who disappeared entirely. Perhaps the most consequential example of all is none other than the arc's main villain, and the very driving force behind the 1000-Year Blood War itself, Yhwach. Now, to say Yhwach disappears entirely, like some of the other prominent characters we've discussed in this series before, would be a little disingenuous, as Yhwach does make two brief final appearances in the very last chapter of the series, and they each vary greatly in their portrayal of him and his current state. But what makes Yhwach such a different, special case when compared to the other characters we've talked about before, Aizen, Grimmjow, Harabel and Neliel, Kisuke and Yoruichi, is that with the best will in the world, their disappearances at the end of the series or their fates after the war ultimately don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, even if they might annoy us as fans. But what's truly crazy then about the manner of Yhwach's final appearance and the way so much of his fate is left to question afterwards is that his fate is quite literally tied to the survival of the Bleach universe. Yes, with Yhwach having completely absorbed his father, the Soul King, as of chapter 626 in the manga and episode 30 in the anime, he in fact becomes the newest Soul King candidate, with both the power to stabilize and collapse the worlds. And so, with Ichigo seemingly having killed Yhwach at the end of chapter 684, and as far as we were concerned, Yhwach was the current acting stand-in for the Soul King, there was one major question left hanging. Why didn't the three worlds collapse after Yhwach's defeat? The new Soul King was dead, right? And there was no one else. There were no heirs, no replacements lined up to be the new Ryo in this circumstance, so what happened? Unfortunately, considering the manga then skips ahead 10 years immediately after the fact, we never found out the truth. Somehow the universe persisted, even after Yhwach's apparent death. Perhaps then he didn't die after all. We couldn't know the answer. That is at least until the light novel Can't Fear Your Own World came around. While the epilogue of the 1000-Year Blood War arc does its absolute best with the space it has to bring the Book of Bleach to a close, with chapters 685 and 686 taking the story into the far-flung future in an exciting twist, it could be said that the true epilogue is found here in the light novels, which act as a direct continuation of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, giving us the immediate aftermath that I so hoped to see to the lengthy battle. In fact, I still hope, and I've said before, that the anime brings this time period to life and expands on it, at the very least showing us what becomes of more of the cast. But I really do think the opening chapter, the prologue to this book in particular, is necessary reading for fans of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and absolutely deserves to be adapted in the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime as a part of that story. So while we don't know what became of Yhwach or why the three worlds survived his death in the source material itself, thankfully Can't Fear Your Own World reveals the Quincy King's tragic fate, and also puts into perspective the sinister machinations of Ichibei Hyosebe, whose true plan was perhaps more terrifying than we could have imagined. Plus, there's also the Hell chapter to consider, which mentions Yhwach as well. But first, before looking at the light novel, how does Yhwach's story come to an end in the manga? Having fully absorbed the Soul King and gaining tremendous godlike power, Yhwach prepared to use that divine strength to collapse the Soul Society, Waco Mundo, and the world of the living into their primordial state, where life and death would exist as one. Having stripped the last vestiges of power and life from his remaining sternritter, and after robbing Ichigo of at least some of the power inherited from his mother, Yhwach makes his escape, heading back to the Soul Society to enact his ultimate plan. Of course, there are still those capable of standing against him even in the final hours of the world. Aizen meets Yhwach in the Serete, and the two do battle until Ichigo and Renji arrive on the scene. Although Yhwach seems to have the upper hand no matter what they try, with his power of the Almighty allowing him to both see and alter the future, it looks like all hope is lost. Until Aizen reveals that he's had Yhwach under the spell of his complete hypnosis for the entire fight, enabling the real Ichigo to land a massive, fatal strike on the Quincy King. Ichigo stabs Yhwach through the back and activates a colossal Getsuga Tensho, the furious wave of golden energy ripping through his enemy and carving him in two. Yhwach's entire body dissipates before Ichigo's very eyes, turning into a black mass of energy and splattering upon the ground in a puddle at their feet. This is definitely a little weird, and I've always wondered about this. With the enormity of the Soul King's power surrounding him at this point, is Yhwach currently just meant to be like a shadowy mass of raw power? Hence the apparent lack of blood, flesh, or anything remotely human. Though, I mean, you can see Yhwach's arm in this one panel, so maybe he does still have a human body here, but it's just completely drowning in this power right now. Either way, Yhwach uses the Almighty to rewrite the future in which he died, allowing him to restore himself and continue fighting. With Aizen subdued, Yhwach at last begins to enact his plan, and for a brief moment, the world of Bleach teeters on the very edge of oblivion itself. This is the worst we've ever seen the state of the world, the closest we've come to the absolute failure and utmost defeat of our heroes. Yhwach's Soul King power floods and devastates the entire Soul Society as he prepares to collapse the worlds into one, genuinely starting the process in a meaningful way at last. As we can see here, Yhwach's power is so great and all-encompassing that it completely and rapidly fills the Shakon Maku before bursting out of the defensive membrane itself and raining down upon the land around the Serete. But there's more. Cracks and chasms appear in the very earth itself as it splits apart, and more of Yhwach's power erupts like lava from the ground beneath their feet. It really does look like the end. But suddenly a silver arrow bursts through Yhwach's chest as Uryu arrives on the scene, utilising the still silver collected by his father to rob Yhwach of all of his powers momentarily, a reverse Alsvalen. This is interesting in itself because, as we can see here in this panel, Yhwach is now quite clearly separated from the Soul King's power. The power still exists, but Yhwach is now merely his human self, standing in the sky far above. And as we can see from the following panel, he begins to regain his power very quickly, but the idea behind this final moment is that Ichigo cuts him in half just in time, before the Almighty returns and allows Yhwach to once again rewrite his future to ensure his survival. Thus, Yhwach in this moment presumably dies. But this is where things get weird. With Ichigo slicing the Quincy King in two, thus ends the 1000-Year Blood War arc, and we are taken right into the 2-chapter epilogue set 10 years later. And again, the epilogue is kind of weird from Yhwach's perspective. Let's start with the brief scene showing the immediate aftermath of chapter 684, which was a nice surprise to get back in the day. It's the only piece of the epilogue that does actually deal with the very aftermath itself. So, after Ichigo slices Yhwach in two, we can see that Yhwach isn't actually dead, at least not outright. He grabs a hold of Zangetsu, but his body does appear to be disappearing, or at the very least again, turning into pure power, taking on an almost liquid-like consistency as he hangs in the air, saying his final words to Ichigo. We can see that his body does appear to be vanishing somewhat, particularly in this one panel, but What's really going on here? We don't know enough about what it means for Yhwach to now embody the Soul King's power. Also, if Ichigo successfully cut Yhwach in two before his power returned in full, then why is this even happening? Shouldn't the human Yhwach have simply been bifurcated and died after falling to the ground? Or does he simply not work like that anymore after having absorbed his father? These questions extend to the rest of the epilogue as well, where we see that 10 years into the future, some of Yhwach's power remained somehow. It's strong enough that it can appear in multiple places across different planes. Some of that power appears in the Sternritter ready to kill the captains, while another globule of power appears in Ichigo's own house, as the last vestiges of the Quincy King attempts to make good on his promise from a decade earlier, that he will wait and single out their moment of greatest happiness in the future, only to kill them then. That's clearly what he's trying to do now, but what I've always wondered is how? How is this possible? Surely this future should have been deleted the moment Ichigo killed Yhwach in the past and removed the power of the Almighty from the world. The only way this makes sense is for some of Yhwach's power to still exist in the immediate aftermath of the war, but then how did Ichigo kill him in the first place? Could it be that Yhwach managed to claw back some of his power in the instant before Ichigo delivered the killing blow, but not enough of it to rewrite his own future once again? But of course, the bigger, more pertinent question is, in the decades since the war, how has the world managed to survive? There are no tremors, no earthquakes, the Soul King's power has disappeared from the newly rebuilt Sternritter. So how has everything managed to return to normal? Well, let's take a look at what happens in Can't For Your Own World to see what answers it provides. So, Yhwach appears to be dead, right? I mean, it's not exactly clear-cut, even in the manga, but that does certainly seem to be the case. Ichigo won, and all is right with the world. He managed to prevent the Quincy King from achieving his goal. Smartly, one of the very first things Can't For Your Own World does is to reveal to us Yhwach's fate, clearly understanding how important that plot point is, and simultaneously introduces us to the new Soul King. First and foremost, how do you go about telling the people, the masses, that the Soul King, this holy figure upon whose back the balance of the world rested, had been murdered? That despite winning the war in the end, the Gotei 13 and the Zero Division failed in their utmost mission? Well, you don't. The truth that Ryo had died was instead kept from the populace, with only a select few high-ranking Shinigami being privy to the truth. Mostly those who were involved in the final invasion to Varvelt, essentially. In reality, however, something much darker has taken place within the newly restored royal palace. After having absorbed the power of the Soul King earlier, Yhwach's corpse now found itself within a similar place between life and death, having inherited that position of stagnation from his father. While I don't think a detailed description is ever given, it wouldn't be too hard to imagine that Yhwach now finds himself in that exact same situation as the Ryo he once set free, now also suffering an endless humiliation at the hands of the Shinigami who are willing to do anything to preserve the status quo. Upon laying his eyes on this new Soul King for the very first time, Kyoraku is visually disturbed by what Ichibei has done. It's interesting, you know, I don't think I quite picked up on this initially, but it seems like Ichibei simply renames Yhwach's corpse to Ryo, and in doing so cements him as the Soul King for the foreseeable future with all of the attributes of the original Soul King. As Kyoraku asks Ichibei if that thing is the new Ryo, Ichibei merely says to the Captain Commander that the concepts of old and new don't hold any meaning for the Soul King, and that there is value in simply having something here to worship and call Ryo. Kyoraku responds by asking Ichibei if all power resides in the name, and of course we know that to be true, before bitterly saying that Ichigo could have found himself sealed within that name in the worst case scenario then. So it seems like, As long as someone is strong enough and meets the requirements to be a so-called Soul King candidate, then Ichibei can rename them Ryo and they too will be sealed, doomed to suffer an eternity of suspended animation like the original Soul King and now Yhwach as well. And it's cool because the anime has already been hinting to Yhwach's ultimate tragic fate in a big way. There are numerous shots of Yhwach himself superimposed over the image of his father, his own reflection being reflected back at us upon the very crystal itself, which does make me think the anime might show this at the end of Core 4. And this is of course Ichibei's cruel, true plan. Before Yhwach absorbed the power of the Soul King, whether Ichigo successfully killed him or was defeated by him, Ichibei was ready to step in and seal Ichigo away, giving him the new name of Ryo and ensuring the world would exist after the original Soul King's death, because at the moment Ichigo was the only Soul King candidate around. This is why in chapter 613 Ichibei ominously tells the humans that they can't win, and that's what peace really means. Willfully sending Ichigo to face Yhwach like a lamb to the slaughter, perhaps sending him to his death. Again, something that in the manga, Yhwach seems to briefly acknowledge by kind of cursing Ichibei under his breath. Something that was interestingly removed from the anime. In reality, Ichibei doesn't care if they win or not. In fact, he may even need Ichigo to lose, as he mentions here in Can't For Your Own World's prologue. The reason he would need Ichigo to lose is because he anticipated Yhwach killing the Soul King, and therefore, if Yhwach at that point in time was not a Soul King candidate, they needed a defeated Soul King candidate to quickly and easily rename as Ryo, which would have been Ichigo. It's honestly terrifying how here in Can't For Your Own World, Ichibei is so indifferent about rendering Ichigo silent, as he himself says, transforming him into the new Soul King if needs be. However, luckily for Ichigo, as Ichibei points out, Yhwach decided to take his father's power for himself in the moment, turning himself into a new Soul King candidate. This meant that Yhwach, not Ichigo, was now first in line to take on the dubious honour of becoming the new Soul King, so in a way, Yhwach's spitefulness towards his father dooms himself. In the manga, he only decides to take the Soul King's power because Mimihagi fights back against him. However, the anime kind of streamlines and tidies this all up, revealing that Yhwach planned on taking his father's power no matter what, as he's going to need it to collapse the worlds, although I feel like killing Ryo should accomplish that anyway, but there you go. So yeah, to summarise, Ichibei had originally planned on using Ichigo to take the Soul King's place should Ryo be killed in the war. And in the anime, we even see Ichibei forcing Ichigo to walk Irazu Sando in a test of whether or not he was actually a Soul King candidate, and of course, he is. This makes sense to me again. Before Yhwach absorbs his father, he's not actually a Soul King candidate, as he is only a Quincy, albeit a very special one. However, once he takes his father's power and becomes, well, the Soul King, he does now qualify, inadvertently sparing Ichigo from a terrible fate. When Ichigo kills Yhwach, reducing him to a state of suspended animation like his father found himself in for millions of years potentially, Ichibei takes Yhwach's corpse and renames it to Ryo, thus finding a new Soul King to hold the worlds together, a silent Yhwach, unable to protest. It's really quite twisted stuff, and as I said, I hope that at the very least, this prologue is adapted into the anime, as it provides some absolutely vital answers. I wonder if Yhwach isn't actually completely dead, if he is aware at all of the situation he now finds himself in. That would be even more horrifying. And then of course there's also the Hell chapter, which mentions that Yhwach's massive Reiatsu has disappeared, along with Aizen's power also vanishing, and that the two of them going away is enough for the denizens of Hell to now be able to break out of their dimension, forcing the gates open. And again, I guess it makes sense, Yhwach's death, followed by his imprisonment, and then much later, followed by Kazui completely decimating the final remnants of Yhwach's Reiatsu in chapter 686, is why his power has now vanished. Though, to be honest, I'm still not entirely sure how Yhwach's power appeared in chapter 686 if he's currently dead and in suspended animation, unable to affect the world around him. Ryo couldn't do anything until the seal on him was broken and his power flooded out uncontrollably, but alas. But there you have it, that's the dark, tragic truth of what happened to Yhwach after the 1000-Year Blood War arc. In his quest to set his father free from the endless humiliation he suffered at the hands of the Shinigami, Yhwach unknowingly doomed himself to that same devastating fate, playing right into Ichibei's own hands. But hey, better Yhwach than Ichigo at least, right? But that's it for the video, guys. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it. I hope you took something of value away from it as well. Let me know down in the comments, what do you think of Yhwach's twisted, tragic fate in the Can't Fear Your Own World light novel and at the end of the 1000-Year Blood War arc as well? Technically, do you think he deserves this fate for the pain and suffering he himself has inflicted, or is this really quite messed up, but then necessary to keep the three worlds intact, to keep the status quo the way the Shinigami, and let's face it, everybody else wants it to be? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this pretty complicated topic, I'd say, down in the comments below. What would have happened if Ichigo had been forced to become the new Soul King, if Ichibei had taken his defeated body and renamed him as Ryo, thus subjecting him to an eternity of suffering in silence? Would people have stood for this, or would there have been outrage? Would people have tried to have stood up against the Zero Division? I'd have loved to have seen something like that. That would be kind of crazy, but that's totally spitballing on my part. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. Guys, make sure to check out my second channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games, if you haven't done already, if you enjoy gaming at all. I'm trying to get that channel to 10,000 subs. I would appreciate all of your support. Thank you to everyone who has gone over there and subscribed and watched any of the videos so far. I really do appreciate it. Make sure to hit subscribe here as well to help take us to 300,000 subs, our next major milestone, if you enjoyed this video today. And of course, as always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without whom I simply wouldn't be able to do this. At the $1 a month tier, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, as someone who helps to make these videos possible. And at the $2 tier or higher, you can enjoy all of my videos completely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, thank you again so very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.